The Mutiny on the Bounty was not the largest mutiny in the Royal Navy's history, but thanks to Hollywood, it's probably its most famous. And thanks too to Hollywood, we all know the Bounty's captain, William Bligh. But did you know that he actually faced 3 mutinies during his career? And did you know that he was never found to be at fault in any of them? In fact, he ended his days as a vice-admiral, fought alongside Nelson, captured a Dutch admiral in battle, and completed one of the longest and epic endurance journeys in the Royal Navy's history. So, was the real William Bligh a villain or a hero? The popular image of Bligh as the despotic disciplinarian driving his men to mutiny is the product of Hollywood. But before you start throwing your eyes to the ceiling, that image is also the work of a Cambridge law professor in the 1790s at the time of the Bounty Mutiny. I bet you weren't expecting that. And we're going to come to him in a moment. But first, Hollywood and that mutiny on the Bounty. A 1930s film starring Charles Laughton as the despotic captain against Clark Gable's dashing Fletcher Christian set the tone. In the 1960s, Trevor Howard once more portrayed Bligh as an over-the-top disciplinarian. And then in the 1980s, Anthony Hopkins played the same role, with Mel Gibson as the mutineer leader, Christian. And that depiction of Bligh as the disciplinarian whose lash of his tongue was as terrifying as the lash of the cat of nine tails has set the popular perception of the man. It doesn't help matters when my Australian viewers know that he faced another mutiny in New South Wales over a decade later. And in between time, he faced another mutiny in British waters. So you might be thinking there's no smoke without fire. And yet this is the very simplified take on a very complex man, who was probably one of the best navigators in the Royal Navy at the time, who fought with distinction in 2 major naval battles, including one where he was praised by Nelson himself, and rose to become a vice-admiral. But the gateway that most of us have into the career starts and ends with the Mutiny on the Bounty. And I've told the whole story of the Mutiny on the Bounty in a previous episode, so please do check it out at the end. Very briefly then, Bligh had been sent on the Bounty to the South Pacific to ship breadfruit plants to the Caribbean, which was seen as a cheap source of food for the slave populations in Britain's colonies. Suffice to say that tensions came to a head, thanks to his vicious tongue and lack of man management skills, along with the crew preferring the holiday lifestyle of Tahiti to naval discipline or a feared journey around Cape Horn. And on the 28th of April 1789, Fletcher Christian led a mutiny. Bligh and 18 men were put into the Bounty's launch, 23 feet long, a little over 6 feet in the beam, designed for 15 men on short passages, and set adrift. What happened next was one of the most impressive feats of navigational sailing in the history of the Royal Navy. Born in the West Country, William Bligh had entered the Royal Navy in 1770, aged 15. He spent 3 years in the Caribbean, where he made several hydrographic surveys which were submitted to the Admiralty, and those navigation skills came to the attention of Captain James Cook. So impressed was Cook that despite Bligh being just 22, he appointed him the master of HMS Resolution on his Pacific expedition. Now, the master was responsible for navigation, piloting, and the working of the ship, whereas the captain was responsible for overall orders and the crew. It was a huge responsibility for a 22-year-old on such a high-profile voyage. For 3 years he sailed the Pacific, and was with Cook when the latter was killed at Hawaii. Whilst that experience would make him one of the most talented navigators of his age, it also gave him little experience of managing men. And both of these, the strength and the weakness, would make regular appearances in his career, starting with the Bounty. When he was cast adrift following the Mutiny on the Bounty, Fletcher Christian refused to give Bligh a chart or a chronologer. 19 men were effectively left bobbing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a 23-foot craft. Incredibly, with just a sextant, a compass, and his own memory, Bligh steered the tiny boat 3,618 nautical miles, that's over 4,000 statute miles, to reach safety. During the 47-day voyage, he eked out the rations. Supposedly, weighing each man's bread ration against a pistol ball on improvised scales, so that pistol ball of bread became the daily allowance. After 47 days at sea, he landed at a Dutch settlement on the island of Timor in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. He had lost just one of the 19 men who'd set out, and that loss had occurred when they'd put ashore on another island and crewman John Norton was killed by local inhabitants. Somewhat ironically, after his endeavours to keep his men alive on that epic journey of survival, 5 of his crew sadly died in the Dutch East Indies or on the voyage back to Britain. Bligh eventually arrived back in England, where in 1790 he published his version of events in a book and was subsequently acquitted of losing his ship at a court-martial. In fact, not only was he exonerated by the Admiralty, but he was then promoted to commander and then a month later to post-captain. 2 years later, 10 of the Bounty mutineers were captured by the Royal Navy in Tahiti and brought back to Britain in chains. At their subsequent trial, 6 were condemned to death for mutiny, although 2 were later pardoned and 1 released on a legal technicality. One of those who was pardoned now combined forces with a law professor from Cambridge University to present the mutineers' case and clear the name of their leader, Fletcher Christian. That law professor went by the name of Edward Christian, Fletcher's older brother, so no bias there then. They published an appendix to Bligh's trial that said that it was indeed Bligh's conduct that had caused the mutiny. And that defence found an audience. It started to produce a counter-narrative to the one that Bligh had published and stood by at his court-martial. And it was that judgment on his character that was eventually taken up by Hollywood. Even at the time, Bligh was conscious of a whispering campaign against him and actually spent the rest of his career trying to prove that he was as competent as any other captain in the Royal Navy. He challenged Edward Christian's stance, obtaining references of competence and good character from any officer willing to provide one, and even calling in the services of Britain's greatest naval hero, Admiral Lord Nelson, as you're going to find out in a while. Despite these criticisms of his leadership or man-management style, the Royal Navy now sent him back to the South Pacific, commanding HMS Providence to complete the Bounty's mission. This time there was no mutiny, maybe helped by the fact that on this expedition the Admiralty had, unlike the previous journey, placed 20 Royal Marines aboard. He successfully collected over 2,000 breadfruit plants and transported them to the Caribbean. Bligh received the Gold Medal of the Society of Arts in 1794 for this voyage. Interestingly, despite his achievement taking the breadfruit plants halfway round the world, the enslaved population initially refused to eat them, and it actually took several generations before breadfruit became the staple that it now is in the Jamaican cuisine. In early 1796, William Bligh was appointed to command the 64-gun warship HMS Director. Part of Admiral Duncan's North Sea Fleet based at Great Yarmouth, before Bligh actually saw any action, he was ordered to sail for the Nore, the anchorage at the mouth of the Thames, to await a refit in nearby dockyards. And it was here, in early 1797, that William Bligh faced his second mutiny. Tensions were already running high on HMS Director after Bligh had ordered 11 men flogged for dereliction of duty. Then, in a somewhat contradictory action, he confined 3 of his own officers to their cabins on accusations that they had ill-used the men. So, interesting, a captain hard on his crew, but equally hard on the officers, who were harder on the men than he was. In April 1797, the Channel Fleet at Spithead refused to sail. The Spithead Mutiny was a disciplined and organised strike over pay, food and conditions, and the Admiralty were eventually forced to make concessions and pardon all the mutineers. A month later, the crews on the ships at the Nore also mutinied. On HMS Director, the crew joined the mutiny, and you can guess who they had their sights on. And if you're thinking it was Captain William Bligh, you'd be wrong. They turned their anger on the 3 officers that Bligh had confined to their quarters. It seems that Bligh had, maybe unwittingly, been on the same wavelength as his men. However, unlike at Spithead, the Nore Mutiny took on a decidedly political or even revolutionary tone, and a fortnight later, Bligh, along with about a dozen other captains, was put ashore by his crew. Now, while some people are quick to point out that this was the second mutiny that William Bligh faced, and it was, he just happened to be a captain involved in a much wider mutiny of about 24 ships. So, not really his fault. Both the Spithead and Nore mutinies rattled the Admiralty. After all, Britain was at war with France, and during the early summer of 1797, nearly 40 Royal Navy vessels refused to put to sea along the south coast of England. Whilst concessions were made to the men protesting about conditions at Spithead, a much tougher line was taken against the more political mutiny at the Nore. When the mutiny eventually collapsed, Vice Admiral Lord Keith demanded that each captain submit the names of the 10 most prominent mutineers on their ships for punishment. William Bligh, the man history remembers as the arch-disciplinarian, objected. He argued that this inferred that every one of those named men was equally guilty, whereas some ships had been far more militant than others. HMS Director's crew had always been pretty much split down the middle in their support for the mutiny. Reminded as to his duty, he did reluctantly submit his quota of names, but ensured that the rest of his crew received full pardons from the Admiralty. Across the Nore, over 400 men were court-martialled for their parts in the mutiny, with 29 leading mutineers hanged and a further 38 imprisoned, transported or flogged around the fleet. Just 4 months later, Bligh's crew were to repay his efforts to protect them from the wrath of the authorities. On the 11th of October 1797, William Bligh and HMS Director were in action against the Dutch fleet at the Battle of Camperdown. Bligh and his crew engaged 3 Dutch ships in succession, Haarlem, Alkmaar, and finally the Dutch commander Admiral de Winter's own 74-gun flagship. Bringing HMS Director to within 20 yards of the Dutch flagship, he poured fire in broadside after broadside and then shifted to a position off her bows from which she could not return fire. Bligh's brutal attack dismasted the Dutch warship, and de Winter was captured by Bligh's boarding party and forced to surrender to Admiral Duncan. HMS Director's casualties in that fierce battle were just 7 men wounded. Not a single man was killed. Just over 3 years later, in April 1801, Captain William Bligh found himself in another naval battle, this time against the Danish fleet and shore batteries at the Battle of Copenhagen. It was during this battle that Admiral Nelson famously held his telescope to his disabled eye so that he couldn't see in order to withdraw. The column of warships that Nelson was leading was trying to navigate down a narrow, badly charted channel, the King's Deep. The Danes had made this task even more precarious by removing the navigation buoys, indicating the nearby shoals, and 3 British warships had already come to grief. Bligh, commanding HMS Glatton, and whose navigation skills were second to none in the Royal Navy, successfully negotiated the treacherous channel and then proceeded to attack the Danish flagship from point-blank range yet again, setting her on fire. After the battle, Bligh was personally thanked by Nelson for his efforts. And then, in an interesting move, Bligh asked Nelson for a written certificate of his good conduct. An unusual request. It seems that despite being cleared of that loss of the bounty all those years ago, Bligh still felt it keenly and was fully aware of persistent whispers about his abilities to command His Majesty's ships. Nelson obliged. In May 1804, Bligh was appointed to the 74-gun HMS Warrior and sailed from Plymouth to join the Channel Fleet blockading the French naval base at Brest. Once more, the same behaviour, his lack of man-management skills and sharp tongue that had alienated Fletcher Christian on the Bounty, made a reappearance. On the 9th of October, he, in full view of the crew, tore a strip off one of his officers, Lieutenant John Fraser, calling him a rascal and a scoundrel and shaking his fist in his face. This continued over the winter months, with not only Fraser but other officers and non-commissioned officers feeling the wrath of Bligh's tongue. Eventually, Fraser had enough and lodged a formal complaint to the Admiralty. Once more, William Bligh ended up in front of a courts-martial. Held aboard HMS San Joseph at anchor off Tor Bay in February 1805, one of the officers on the panel was none other than Cuthbert Collingwood, who would be Nelson's number 2 at Trafalgar later that year. the court found that the charges were in part proved and officially reprimanded Bligh, admonishing him to be more correct in future in his language. Whilst he was allowed to return to HMS Warrior, where incidentally he proceeded to clear out all the officers who'd either testified against him or indeed remained neutral, it was to be his last command at sea. Just a year later, in 1806, he was heading to the fledgling British colony of New South Wales, Australia. And yet another mutiny. Appointed Governor of New South Wales, he arrived in August 1806 with instructions to break the local army, the New South Wales Corps, stronghold on trade and the use of rum as currency. Resenting this break on their commercial activities, and Bligh's once more brusque approach, in January 1808, the senior officer of the Corps, Major George Johnson, led a mutiny, the third that Bligh faced in his career. Marching on Government House, Johnson and his men supposedly found Bligh hiding under the bed and arrested him. Now, I've covered this mutiny, known as the Rum Rebellion, in a previous episode, so I won't go into the details here. Suffice to say that a new governor eventually arrived, and Johnston was court-martialled in England in 1811. The principal witness against him was William Bligh, a man who had spent his whole career passionately defending his own name and reputation, and this time was no different. Johnston was convicted of mutiny and cashiered, and his deposition of Bligh was declared illegal. Once more, William Bligh walked away basically exonerated. He was never given another command or land or at sea, although he did eventually rise to Vice Admiral in 1814. He died in London in December 1817, aged 63, and was buried at St Mary at Lambeth. The epitaph on his impressive tomb, actually built for his wife and 2 children who had died, calls him the celebrated navigator who first transported the breadfruit tree from Tahiti to the West Indies, and records that he bravely fought the battles of his country. Strangely enough, it doesn't mention the mutiny on the Bounty, nor in fact his epic survival journey that resulted from it. So, 3 mutinies, but never found to be at fault, reprimanded by a court-martial who told him to speak more civilly or professionally to his officers, hero at the Battle of Camperdown, and highly rated by Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen. Was William Bligh a villain or a hero? In many ways, we are all preconditioned thanks to Charles Laughton, Trevor Howard and Anthony Hopkins's Hollywood representations of Bligh. We sort of know him and are looking for the worst. His sharp tongue on HMS Warrior led to a court-martial. That same sharp tongue certainly contributed to the mutiny on the Bounty. We know Bligh as an overzealous disciplinarian, and yet when Admiral Keith wanted the names of 10 leading mutineers at the Nore, Bligh had objected. Indeed, at the start of the mutiny, his men threw 3 officers off the ship who'd been confined to quarters by Bligh for their harsh treatment of his men. Greg Denning, Emeritus Professor of History at Melbourne, published Mr Bligh's Bad Language with Cambridge University Press in 1992. He counted every lash recorded in the logs of 15 Royal Navy vessels in the Pacific between 1765 and 1793. He found that across the whole fleet, 21% of men received a flogging of at least 5 lashes. Captain Cook flogged anywhere between 20 and 37% of his men across his 3 Pacific voyages, and George Vancouver flogged nearly half his men, averaging 21 lashes per man. In contrast, he found that only 19% of men on Bligh's vessels received a flogging, and those floggings were between just 1 and 2 lashes. So, yes, a disciplinarian, and in certain circumstances, like the epic lifeboat journey, he needed to be. But he certainly was not at the draconian end of Royal Navy captains during this period. So, where did it all go so wrong for him? The problem was that whilst he reached for the lash less frequently than his contemporaries, the lash of his tongue was vicious. And that was coupled with little experience of commanding men. I mentioned earlier that he'd been the master of HMS Resolution during Cook's Pacific explorations. That gave him the skills and map in his mind that saved him on that epic voyage. The same skills, by the way, that had impressed Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen. The flip side was that the first 10+ years of his Royal Navy career had not involved managing a crew, knowing when to be hard and when to be lenient, knowing when and how to give a dressing down without it souring a ship's morale for months afterwards. What we might call soft skills. Hero or villain? Well, I'll let you decide. Personally, I think it's neither extreme, and that William Bligh was, like so many other heroes, a far more complex man than Hollywood or popular culture likes to paint him. If you enjoy learning about British history, then please sign up for my free weekly newsletter where I share even more stories about the people and events from Britain's past. There's a link in the description below. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing more stories from Britain's fascinating history with you very soon.